To understand the thunder of the guns in 1948, we must first understand the silence of the diplomats in 1917. The British Empire, locked in the titanic struggle of the First World War, sought allies wherever they could find them. This led to the Balfour Declaration, a letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, expressing support for a Jewish national home. At the same time, promises were made to the Sharif of Mecca regarding Arab independence. These two promises, made by an empire on which the sun never set, laid the foundation for a century of sunrise over battlefields. By the time 1947 arrived, the British Mandate of Palestine was a pressure cooker. The Holocaust had left hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors looking for a home, while the local Arab population saw their ancestral lands being reshaped by global politics. The British, unable to maintain order, handed the mandate to the United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181. The map was a chaotic mosaic of Jewish and Arab cantons. The Jewish Agency celebrated in the streets of Tel Aviv, but in the coffee houses of Jerusalem and Cairo, the mood was one of defiance. Civil war erupted the next morning, but it was merely the overture to the grand symphony of destruction that was to follow. The afternoon of May 14th was a humid, tense day in Tel Aviv. Inside the Tel Aviv Museum, under a portrait of Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion stood up. His voice was steady, but he knew that, as he spoke, the words of the Declaration of Independence, 5 armies were already fueled and ready to cross the border. We hereby proclaim the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel, he declared. Simultaneously, at the port of Haifa, the British High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, was piped aboard a Royal Navy ship. As the Union Jack descended, a power vacuum was created that was instantly filled by the sound of tank treads. Egypt from the south, Jordan and Iraq from the east, and Syria and Lebanon from the north. The Arab League called it Operation Sarath. Their objective was total victory in 15 days. They possessed the Spitfires, the Sherman tanks, and the heavy artillery. The Israelis at this moment had no tanks, no planes, and a disorganized militia known as the Haganah. The world expected a massacre. The first major blow came from the Syrian 1st Brigade. They crossed the Jordan River at dawn on May 15th, targeting the lush valley of the Galilee. The Syrians were not a ragtag group. They were a professional army equipped with French Renault R-35 tanks. These machines, though small, were terrifying to the local kibbutz defenders who had only bolt-action rifles and homemade grenades. The Syrians captured the village of Zemak and moved toward Degania Aleph. This was the mother of the kibbutzim, a symbol of the Jewish connection to the land. The defenders had no choice but to hold or die. As the Syrian tanks breached the perimeter, crawling over the agricultural trenches, the defenders used the only thing they had: Molotov cocktails. A young man stood in a trench, waited for a Renault tank to pass, and hurled a bottle of gasoline into the engine vent. The tank became a torch. This single act of defiance caused the Syrian armored column to halt in confusion. They retreated to the Golan Heights, shifting their strategy from a ground invasion to a brutal artillery siege that would last for months. While the north was a desperate defensive struggle, Jerusalem was a tragedy. 100,000 Jews in the Holy City were cut off from the coast. The road to Jerusalem passes through a narrow mountain pass at Latrun, which was occupied by the Arab Legion of Transjordan. The Legion was the elite force of the Middle East, commanded by British officers like Sir John Bagot Glubb. They were disciplined, well-fed, and possessed superior artillery. Ben-Gurion realized that if Jerusalem fell, the morale of the new state would collapse. He ordered Operation Bin Nun, a frontal assault on the Latrun fortress. It was a disaster. Immigrants who had just stepped off ships from Europe, some still wearing their civilian clothes, were marched into the valley under a blistering sun and mowed down by Legion machine guns. To bypass this bone in the throat, Israeli engineers and hundreds of volunteers began a secret project. The Burma Road. Working under the cover of night, they carved a steep path through the jagged hills of the Judean mountains. By June, the first supply trucks reached Jerusalem, bringing bread and bullets to a population that was on the verge of starvation. By June 11th, both sides were exhausted. The UN managed to negotiate a 28-day truce. The Arab League saw this as a chance to rest, but the Israelis saw it as a chance to rearm. In a series of clandestine operations known as Operation Balak, Israeli agents bypassed international embargoes to purchase massive quantities of arms from Czechoslovakia. The most critical acquisition was the Avia S-199, a Czech-built fighter plane. They were assembled in secret hangars in Tel Aviv. When the truce ended on July 9th, the 10 days of fighting began. The Arab armies expected to find an exhausted militia, but instead, they were met by a modern army with heavy artillery and a small but lethal air force. The tide had begun to turn. As the war progressed into October 1948, the Israeli High Command realized that the state's survival depended on the south. The Egyptian Expeditionary Force had established a formidable horizontal line across the northern Negev, effectively cutting off over 20 Jewish settlements. These communities were surviving on bread and water, flown in by tiny transport planes in the dead of night. David Ben-Gurion gave the order for Operation Yoav. This was to be the most complex combined arms operation in the Middle East to date. The operation began with a roar that shook the desert floor. The Israeli Air Force, now boasting a small fleet of B-17 flying fortresses, clandestinely acquired from surplus stocks in the West, launched a devastating raid on Egyptian airfields at El Arish in Gaza. This wasn't just a strategic strike, it was a psychological one. The Egyptian commanders, who had enjoyed total air superiority in May, now found their Spitfires burning on the tarmac. On the ground, the Givati, Negev, and 8th Armored Brigades launched a multi-pronged assault. The fighting centered around the strategic junction of Negev. The Egyptians had dug in deep, utilizing anti-tank ditches and heavy machine gun nests. But the IDF had a new tactical edge: motorized mobility. Using specialized equipment to bridge anti-tank ditches under heavy fire, Israeli armor bypassed the main Egyptian strongpoints and struck their rear. By October 21st, Beersheba, the biblical capital of the Negev, fell into Israeli hands. This shattered the Egyptian wall and opened the road to the Red Sea. One of the most dramatic stories of Operation Yoav was the encirclement of the Fallujah pocket. Nearly 4,000 Egyptian troops, under the command of Brigadier General Syed Taha, were trapped in a small enclave. Among them was a young, ambitious major named Gamal Abdel Nasser. For months, these men held out against relentless Israeli pressure. The Egyptian government in Cairo, paralyzed by internal politics and corruption, failed to provide a relief force or even basic supplies. Nasser and his comrades survived on meager rations, but as they sat in their trenches, their resentment shifted from their Israeli enemies to their own leaders in Cairo. They felt betrayed. It was in the dust of the Fallujah pocket that the seeds of the 1952 Egyptian Revolution were sown. Nasser later wrote that the true battle wasn't in Palestine, but against the ghosts of corruption in Egypt. By December 1948, the war reached its final, most dangerous phase. David Ben-Gurion authorized Operation Horev, a massive push to drive the remaining Egyptian forces out of mandatory Palestine entirely. The tactical plan was a masterpiece of deception. Instead of a frontal assault on the coastal road where the Egyptians expected them, the IDF utilized an ancient, forgotten Roman road buried under the desert sands. Engineers worked in silence at night, uncovering the stone path to allow armored columns to bypass the Egyptian flank. The Egyptians at Auja al-Hafir were stunned to see Israeli tanks emerging from the impassable desert. The IDF surged into the Sinai Peninsula, reaching the outskirts of El Arish. This move threatened to cut off the entire Egyptian army in Gaza. However, this sparked an international crisis. Great Britain, fearing for the Suez Canal, issued an ultimatum: withdraw from Egypt or face British military intervention. In the chaos, Israeli pilots shot down 5 British Spitfires in a single day. Facing the threat of a war with a superpower, Ben-Gurion ordered a tactical withdrawal to the international border, setting the stage for peace talks. The war finally moved from the trenches to the Hotel de Rose on the Greek island of Rhodes. UN mediator Dr. Ralph Bunche presided over proximity talks, as the Arab delegations refused to sit in the same room as the Israelis. For months, Bunche navigated a maze of egos and historical grievances. On February 24, 1949, Egypt signed the first agreement securing the Gaza Strip. Jordan followed in April, leading to the creation of the Green Line. Using a thick green grease pencil on a map, military commanders divided Jerusalem and the West Bank. The line was so thick that in reality, it created hundreds of yards of no man's land. Syria signed the final agreement in July, creating volatile demilitarized zones. The war resulted in the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians, al-Nakba, and the eventually exodus of 800,000 Jews from Arab lands. The 1948 war didn't bring peace, it brought a long pause. The battle line was drawn, and the world was